McFadden. Monday, April 27th, 1981. The interview is being conducted by Bernice M. Hetzner, Emeritus Professor, McGugan Library of Medicine. Dr. McFadden, will you start this record off by telling us what your current title is at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, because we had so many titles that let's set the record straight for the current one.
Currently I'm professor and chairman of the Department of Medical Microbiology. I'm also a professor of pathology.
You're a native of Nebraska?
That's correct. I was born in Nebraska in 1919 and lived in the town of my birth until I was in the 6th grade of grammar school, at which time we moved to a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And I lived there with my family until the end of my junior year in high school, at which time we moved to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where I finished high school, and subsequently I went to University of Nebraska at Lincoln.
Your father was a physician, wasn't he?
Yes, that's correct. And practiced in Llewellyn, Nebraska initially, and following that in approximately 1913 moved to Greenwood, Nebraska, where he practiced until we moved to Chicago. When we moved to Chicago, he had entered the Veterans Administration service, and subsequently, during World War II, was in the armed services, as he had been in World War I, and then finished his career in the Veterans Administration service, ultimately here in Omaha. And he died in 1969.
When did you decide you wanted to be a doctor? Or was it just all your life you were going to be a doctor?
I guess that's difficult for me to say and be honest about it. It's been so long ago that I take it for granted that that's what I had decided to be and wanted to be, but I'm sure that's not true. During those formative years, I'm sure my parents were very careful not to encourage me or discourage me.
Father, your parents were careful to let you make your own choices, I'm sure.
Yes, very much so, and I was very interested in things of history, geography, biology, and those general areas throughout high school. And fortunately, the two high schools I attended were very large multidisciplinary high schools, which offered me a great opportunity to participate in a variety of coursework and programs, including debate, athletics, and the like. And so by the time I went to college, I knew I had great interest in chemistry and biology, and considerable interest in biology. And I think either by the time I went to college or early in that career, I decided that I wanted to go into medicine.
And you went to college at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln?
That's correct. I started there in 1937, in September of that year, and went 3 years to UNL, and during that time I took a heavy course load, so I was admitted after my junior year to medicine, and after my first year of medicine I had sufficient credits I could graduate with a Bachelor of Arts degree from UNL in 1941.
So then you entered medical school about 1940?
1940 in September.
There were rumblings of war at that time, weren't there?
Yes, actually at the time of admission, I think relatively little thought was given to involvement by our nation in that matter, at least among people who were working every day and going to school, things of that sort. However, during my medical education career, of course, things became more complicated, and we were, most of us, the male members of the class, in one of the armed services, either the Army or the Navy, and I happened to be in the Army program. At first we were in a reserve program, and ultimately in the so-called ASTP program during the final part of my medical school days, and during that time we wore uniforms and so on. I had spent quite a bit of time in the artillery in Lincoln and
in ROTC?
In ROTC, although I hadn't, because I came to medical school at the end of my junior year, I hadn't completed it, so I didn't have any serious consideration about going in the service in the artillery, and I was quite far along in medical education at the time of the United States' actual involvement in the war. And so I didn't have any more than the usual concern, I'm sure, of students at that time about entering the service early.
Was it an accelerated program at that time?
Yes, our program was accelerated during the time I was in school. Our particular class graduated in December of 1943, and our class was accelerated approximately 6 months. Normally we would have graduated in May or June of 1944. Subsequent classes were speeded up approximately 1 year in the 4-year program.
Remember in the interview I had with Dr. Holyoke talking about how the new students kept coming in and trying to keep up.
I'm sure it was a difficult time for the students and the faculty in retrospect, because the classes just went on all the time with no opportunity for breaks, and much of the program became rather didactic, so we spent large numbers of hours in the classroom position listening to lectures and conferences.
The program, though, even the normal program back in that time, was there very much clinical work on the part of the students?
Well, it depends on the way you look at it. We had considerable in the junior and senior years, although the faculty at that time, clinical faculty, was somewhat depleted because of the war. At that time, it was the practice in the junior and senior year both to serve clinical clerkships, which were done on rotation. And at that time, the workup of the patient was a rather detailed workup of history and physical examination, which is not unique. But in addition, we had to write a clinical pathological correlation on history and the physical findings, the lab work, the progress of the patient and the library review of whatever disease was involved. So although the numbers of patients we saw as individual students were not huge, we did work them up rather thoroughly. In addition, typical ward walks happened, as I'm sure happened today. And in addition, during the junior year, we had rather extensive didactic clinical coursework. And we were required to read Cecil's textbook of medicine from cover to cover. And I remember the weekly quiz section. My quiz master was Dr. Morris Margolin, who was a very thorough and rigorous examiner each week, and so each of us did our best to be well prepared for that particular session.
Where along the line did you decide you would like to specialize in pathology?
Well, that came a bit later, and I suppose during medical school I had always been interested in the reasons why things happen. And so the reasons why things happen in disease was somewhat the field of pathology. Also during medical school I became very interested in infectious diseases and what we now call medical microbiology. For some reason those courses fascinated me as a basic science student and as a clinical student. But really I liked most things in medicine, and at the end of my medical student education I had eliminated a few fields that I didn't think I would like, but by and large I liked most of them, so I hadn't made up my mind really at graduation. And so in talking with Dr. Perry Tolman something about my career, he suggested I might spend a year in pathology as a resident until I made up my mind what I wanted to do. And during that year I liked very much what I did, and as I was shortly to go off into service, I continued during the service in that field, and when I came back I guess I had so much involved in pathology I gave no other field serious consideration, but I certainly have not regretted my decision.
Well, at that time then, you came back to, after your war services, I understand you had a lot of experience in lab work when you were in Berlin. Did you
Correct.
Have some stations here in this country before going abroad?
Yes.
Overseas?
I had an accelerated internship and an accelerated first-year residency in pathology, following which I went into the service. And after going through the field training school in Pennsylvania, at which time the war officially ended, I went with a group of 75 physicians and 75 dentists as replacements to the ETO. And I spent some time, which I'll come back to, here in this country at Fitzsimmons Army Medical School in Denver, Colorado. And there I spent 8 or 9 months, I believe, in instruction, actually as an instructor for medical technologists, radiologic technologists, surgical technicians, medical technicians, and the like, which was a training program really for Army recruits to bring them along to a level of proficiency. In going overseas with the group on arriving, there were 3 of us who had some training in pathology, and we were singled out by the colonel who addressed the group, and And he then inquired if there were two persons interested in pathology, and following some looking around the room, a couple of weak hands went up, and they were enlisted then to be medical officers in laboratory in the ETO. Of the group of three, I, of course, had 9 months in residency. Another chap had 9 months. And one chap had 27. One with 27 became a theater pathologist, and the other two of us became the next ranking pathologist, believe it or not. And I was assigned to Berlin. The other chap was assigned to Vienna. And in Berlin, which I knew a great deal about, of course, that was an isolated city by the Russian zone. And I went in by train, which required orders signed personally by the 4 commanding generals of Berlin from the occupying forces. So once there, I didn't have easy time to travel around Europe. So I spent most of my time in Berlin proper, and 279th Station Hospital was the station hospital for the American forces in Berlin, and I was the chief of laboratory services while I was stationed. Many interesting things happened during that period of time.
I'm sure there must have been. Being thrust into a situation where you're entirely in charge, and your superior was off someplace else?
That's correct. It was in the theater laboratory, so we had, very little opportunity for communication, and most of the physicians at the hospital were other young physicians, such as I was. I think the hospital worked very well, and I think we gave good care. Fortunately, the people we had to take care of were relatively young and healthy, so while we saw a considerable variety of illness, I'm sure it would not be the same as a community hospital here.
But these were not battle casualties.
No, these were not battle casualties at that time. These were the occupation forces, if you will.
Well, then you came back to Nebraska in the medical center, the College of Medicine then it was.
Right.
This was about when?
Well, I came back in 1948 and sort of picked up the threads of my education and career at that time. And on coming back, I did look around the country a bit first about where I might choose to locate. And by that time, I was married, and we decided to return to Omaha and complete my education in pathology, and that we did. And because of my interest in microbiology, I also did work with Dr. Gunderson in that area in those time period. My training period was a little extended because of duality of my interests and the types of things I was doing here at the time.
But at that time, it was the Department of Pathology and Bacteriology, wasn't it?
Correct. That's correct. And during World War II, Dr. Gunderson had done a lot of research with the armed forces dealing with food and the processing of foods, eggs, and perishable products in particular. And as a result of that, he had continuing research in that general area at the conclusion of the war, and I participated in some of that in those early years.
There wasn't a great deal of research going on the campus at that time, was there?
That's correct. Certainly not by what we would consider levels of research of today. The departments were all quite small, and there was no real full-time clinical faculty except for Dr. Getgood and a physician in OBGYN.
Brown.
His name escapes me, and it was Dr. Brown. And so basically there were relatively few people for the educational and service functions, and while research of high quality did go on, it was not voluminous, and certainly not voluminous when compared with that in larger schools.
Or like it is today.
Correct. Correct.
Well, you mentioned full-time clinical faculty. About this time is when they started talking about full-time clinical faculty.
That's
right?
correct. It was shortly after I came back. I don't remember the precise years that the changes occurred, but I hadn't thought about it for a long time, so I don't remember exactly when there began to be an influx of full-time clinical faculty who initially were brought in as chairman of major clinical departments to serve in that role.
Who was dean when you came back?
The dean when I came back was Harold Luth. The dean when I went away was Dr. Pointer. And of course I had not known Dr. Luth prior to coming back to the campus.
Well, if I remember correctly, it was during Dean Luth's tenure that some of the full-time faculty began to come in.
That's correct.
As a member of the basic science department, were you involved in the controversy that grew up around the decision to bring in full-time people?
I suppose in some degree, in looking back on it, I don't particularly see that event as particularly controversial. I didn't hear a lot of controversy about bringing in the initial chairman of those departments. I think there became some controversy later when there was discussion of enlarging those departments and increasing the number of full-time faculty in clinical departments and lessening the role of the voluntary faculty.
Well, there seems to be, in the interviews I've conducted, some concern that on the part of people in the clinical departments.
I think really at that time there was probably a mixed feeling both among the full-time and the voluntary faculty as to the wisdom, and I'm sure many of the voluntary faculty supported a full-time clinical faculty, and others did not. And so I suppose it depends a little on where you sat or who you talked to as to how big a controversy this was envisioned and was.
I think even now, talking to various people, that's your appraisal of the situation is very accurate.
Probably the biggest controversy that I saw was the one which was related to the possibility of building a new University of Nebraska hospital, which would be of larger size than our current hospital and in a different location. And of course this discussion came considerably later than we're talking about at the moment.
When you finished your residency then, or did this happen at the same time? What I'm trying to get at is your first faculty appointment.
Well, my first faculty appointment would have been at the time I was still a resident or fellow, and I think I had some kind of a faculty title in 1948. At the same time, I was a fellow or resident in pathology and bacteriology. And I was a bit of a procrastinator in taking my specialty board examinations. In 51, I had really completed my training a couple of years before that, but I didn't get around to taking the examination until that time.
Now you're giving them.
Right, that's correct.
In charge of the whole show. You did some teaching while you were in the Army on the level of medical technology. How do you feel about teaching, or when did you get the...
Well, I had done a small amount of teaching as a resident before the service and participated in student study sessions and had given a few lectures. The Army experience was actually an excellent one. The colonel in charge of the program was dedicated to having good training officers, and there was a young professional in educational techniques which was very useful to the group of young physicians assigned to that duty with no particular background or ability. And I can remember many times when the faculty would be short-handed, we might give as many as 8 lectures in a day, believe it or not, an hour in length each, or 50 minutes in each, so one got lots of practice and lots of repetition. But this young officer was very good in analyzing our material and helping us to see what we actually did. He recorded some of our lectures and played them back to us, and one couldn't believe how you sounded or what you said and all of those kinds of things. So I think that was really a very helpful thing for me to do. Of course, when I did come back, I did a great deal of teaching, and I've always enjoyed teaching, and I've always enjoyed the education of students and trying to help them. So that's kind of a fun thing for me to do.
Well, it's also a very good reason why you've been singled out many times by the students as an outstanding teacher.
Yes, I hope that's true, and I appreciate very much those awards. I suppose in recent years I haven't been as close to the classes as I was in those earlier years, and I don't give as many formal courses or lectures currently as I used to do. In those years, we came to know individual students much better than today, largely through formal laboratory sessions, which all of the basic science departments had. So there's probably a decade or two of student groups that I know all the students very, very well by name and what they're doing and where they are.
Yes.
And of course I know them much better than I know the current group of students, which is unfortunate, but is real.
Yes, but one cannot be involved in administrative affairs as much as you've been and still be involved in classrooms,
that's correct.
lab situations.
That's correct.
Yes. I would like to have you enlarge a little bit upon the reasons behind and the progression of the Department of Pathology and Bacteriology and how it split up into pathology and microbiology.
Well, I don't know all of the background or probably all of the reasons for that decision, but at that particular point in time, the Department of Pathology and Bacteriology was a combined department, and the Department of Physiology and Pharmacology was a combined department. And shortly after World War II, there was a considerable thrust in medical education to separate departments of that sword into the fundamental disciplines of each. And so there was considerable discussion at the national level. And I remember vaguely that there were discussions from the accreditation groups who periodically reviewed the College of Medicine that it would be desirable to divide these disciplines and allow them to grow. And of course both departments ultimately division of pathology and bacteriology. He felt that each was a discipline unique in its own aspects, and that they should be separated to allow them to develop optimally so that neither one would impede the development of the other. I think he also welcomed the opportunity to potentially head a department of bacteriology, or as it became known as medical microbiology. And now I was not aware of any great faculty ferment for such divisions. Faculty groups were small at the time. There weren't any particular debates in the faculty or the administration concerning these that I'm aware of. And so the decision, when implemented, was not debated a great deal, and certainly I didn't hear a lot of dissent concerning the separation.
Well, the content of both fields probably was growing to such an extent that you really needed a separate.
Oh my, yes, there's no question about that, and it was very, very difficult for whoever would try to chair such a large combined department to really do justice to all areas and even be informed as to what was really going on in the disciplinary areas of their department. And thinking back on the textbooks I had as a medical student to what they are today, the development of the discipline is just totally unreal. For example, all of virology was covered in a single chapter of our textbook of bacteriology. And of course now it's a lifetime discipline for professionals in that particular field. And medical microbiology is a big composite. I mentioned virology, and I should point out that very early in the combined department, Dr. Oliver and Mrs. Helen Reihart became interested in studies of virology, particularly poliomyelitis virus and some animal viruses, and they initiated some work in the department, which were the beginnings of our current virology laboratory. Subsequent years, and for a considerable period of time, our virology laboratory has been headed by Dr. Roberta White. And she's done, in my opinion, a very professional and a very outstanding job in helping develop this laboratory. Until now it's a unique resource in the state of Nebraska. It's, in fact, at this time, the only complete and real virology laboratory we have. And she does considerable work for the State Department of Health. And of course we center all of our service and research and educational aspects of virology on this one area. And of course the types of techniques you must use and so on, and the development of the field are beyond anything I would have dreamed about when I was a student. And for many years I think physicians thought that virology wasn't very practical. It was interesting, but wasn't going to affect them too much. They couldn't do anything about it. Well, that's no longer true. The state of the art is such that it's a very, very important part of medicine today.
That's right. Well, now, when did you get from medical microbiology and teaching, and then how come you got over into the administration side of things? And well, before we do that, I guess we ought to talk a little bit about what happened during the Tolman administration and the Whitson administration.
Well,
Here.
early on in the department, when the department was divided, I had a very difficult choice to make because I very much liked pathology and what became medical microbiology. And quite by chance, I suppose, I stayed with medical microbiology with Dr. Gunderson. That would have been about in 1955, I believe. The department was divided, and about that time he became very interested in consultative work and in the area of food microbiology, and he was called about the country a great deal in this regard, and he had close ties with the Swanson Food Company, and they were trying to encourage him to become a consultant for their laboratories in all aspects of microbiology and foods. And he resisted those temptations, which were offered considerably more financially than he was making as an educator and worker here at the college. But about the time that the Swanson Foods decided to merge with Campbell Soup, they made him an offer which he felt he couldn't turn down, and so he went with them, and then for a time stayed on the faculty in a voluntary way. And at that time, there really wasn't a lot of backup in the department. For some reason, they asked me if I would be the temporary chairman, and I agreed to do this. And ultimately, about a year later, they made me the chairman of the department. At that time, there wasn't a formal search process as we have it today. And who made that decision, I'm not sure. But at any rate, the offer was made. I decided to accept it. Following Dr. Luth as dean, Dr. Tolman, of course, became dean. At that time, he was in the Air Force.
Yes.
And he came back to assume the role as dean. And of course, he's a person of whom I'm very fond. And Dr. Tolman is undoubtedly the fairest human being I have ever known, and I have more respect than I can tell you for him. He was so fair, in fact, that it seemed to his close friends that sometimes he leaned over backwards to be maybe not quite as fair to those he knew very, very well. But at any rate, he was a very fine man, and did a lot to develop the educational and service programs of the university and its medical center. Subsequent to his tenure as dean, of course, Dr. Cecil Whitson, who is also a very close friend and a very unique individual in a different way, became dean. And when Dr. Whitson became dean, we were in a period of great expansion of research and development in medical centers around the country. And he had a unique capacity to generate new ideas and new concepts, and I'm sure he must have laid awake many nights or risen early many mornings to think of the ideas that he generated. He usually tried his ideas out on a limited number of people, and sometimes they were, in the view of those discussing them with him, kind of outlandish. And some of those ideas just disappeared, but many of his concepts were excellent and possible and doable, and he did them. And he had an enormous ability to organize people into working groups to get things done, and was very capable in his dealings with the legislature, with central administration of the university, with federal granting agencies and the like. And so he presided over a very considerable expansion in the building program of the campus, which was long overdue and highly desirable. So I have only the best memories of both of those individuals.
Yes, yes, I think we all do. Yeah, yeah. Well, were you involved in the? I know you were involved in the planning of Wits and Hall.
Yes, correct.
How about the hospital?
To a certain extent. Now, of course, the hospital was built in several spurts,
Yes.
and the earlier spurt was largely under the leadership of Dr. Tolman at the working level. The latest addition to the hospital and the remodeling of much of the older facilities came under the generation of Dr. Whitson, and I probably played a role in listening to his ideas and saying, that's great, or I don't think that one's so good. But I did, along with other faculty in pathology and anatomy and microbiology, participate very much in the development of Wits and Hall. Mm-hmm. And I think the faculty are generally proud of the working arrangements which are present in Wits and Hall. And they've proved in the 12 years since to be very workable.
That's about the time that it takes to really find out whether your plans more for the immediate future is going to hold up.
The only planning that went awry, probably, and over the long haul it probably will not, but at the time Wits and Hall was planned, the basic science departments for the most part had extensive laboratories. So after discussions about class size, interdepartmental laboratories were built in Wits and Hall. About the time we completed it, we went on the 3-year curriculum, which of course did not allow laboratories. And so working student hands-on labs sort of faded in the last 12 years, and we've continued in microbiology demonstration type laboratories. With the reinstitution of 4 years, we begun to put in just a few student hands-on laboratories. I guess we haven't analyzed to date whether we'll really develop it as we had it in the past or not.
Have you found the use of audio visuals or those learning resource materials helpful? And
I think so, and certainly from the standpoint of the student, they have far more aids to assist them with the educational process than I had as a medical student. In my day, we had fundamentally our textbooks, the medical library that we could ferret through as individuals, and the talents of the faculty as lecturers. There was an occasional movie which might be shown, but that was about the extent of audiovisual usage and production. Of course, there are a great many different approaches now, and I think the diversity of these may confuse the students from time to time a little bit.
Could be.
There's so much available to them that sometimes I wonder if they don't collected in a pile on their desk at home and never bother to get through all of it.
Or take any time to analyze it and see whether they want to accept that.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I think as a student, personally, we had to do all of our reviews as individuals or in groups generated ourselves. And of course, the review process is much more part of the educational program today than it was at that time, which has many good benefits, but for many students, I'm afraid it denies them the opportunity to really do the work to organize all of the data in their own way, and they accept someone else's organization, which I think happened to be a bit of a handicap, but overall those facilities are great. And certainly the educational facilities in the library are quite different than I saw.
Well, even when we started the library, we weren't just sure, how it was going to go.
I'm sure that's right.
And the amount of hardware and software that's available now is just, we just didn't even know about it then.
That's correct. Computers were not really dreamed of.
No. Well, so Dr. Whitson decided that he would retire, and by this time they had this search committee review bit.
Correct.
And so we needed an interim chancellor.
Yes. The first knowledge I had of this was an approach from Dr. Whitson himself, indicating that he was thinking of retiring, and if he did, and if I were asked, would I consider the possibility, and that I don't know what discussions, if any, he had before that discussion with me, but I had thought about this for a few days and told him, well, I really hoped he wasn't going to retire at all, but and that if he did, he would wait himself through the search process, so there would not be need for an interim position. He believed at that time that was not a desirable thing to do, and subsequently I was asked to serve during that period, which I did, and that was a very unique and different kind of experience than I had ever had before. And subsequently, Dr. Robert Sparks was chosen as Chancellor of the Medical Center. Now, Dr. Whitson had served both as Dean and the first Chancellor, but by the time he retired, he had separated the two positions, and there was a Dean of Medicine in place at the time. And now, how wide the discussions were, I really don't know, Bernice.
Well, this went on for almost a year, didn't it?
That's correct. It went on longer than
you thought
I anticipated, or the people who talked to me was Chancellor, was President Varner, who asked me officially to fill the position. He thought it would be perhaps 3 or 4 months at the most. The great outset 6, but afraid the search process is ponderous and slow, and so it really lasted a considerably longer period. It wasn't a full year, but it was the better part of the year.
Seemed like it.
Yes, it seemed like it.
What were some of the big woolly worms that crawled out at that time?
Well, when I sort of went into the position, there was considerable budget debate, and so I was thrust into budgetary considerations with the medical center and the central administration and the legislature, and that was quite a new experience for me, as you might anticipate. And I was also always amazed by the number of calls the chancellor of a medical center receives about all sorts of issues, many of them to the person who serves in the post relatively minor, others of them relatively major, quite a number of calls of complaint and problems, real and imagined, and many calls about which one could not do much. And I always felt that Friday afternoon was the period when I was apt to have visitors from the faculty or the staff come to the office to tell me about problems. And, at that time, usually the problems were of such a nature that after listening, they were often dispensed with by the statement, well, what do you really expect me to do about that? And often the individuals had not thought about that, and they were surprised and often said, well, just to listen, I guess. And so sometimes those afternoons were therapeutic, I suspect, rather than really helpful in decision-making or implementation. When I did take the post, I did indicate that I didn't want to be just a caretaker who would do nothing, but I'd have to have the authority and the backing to continue to do the things that had been started and so on. And so I did my best not to allow things to gear